Okay, welcome back to part 2 of this lecture on composition and page structure. And based on the pace that I'm going through this, this may actually be a three-parter lecture. But I think it is kind of worth it because, as I mentioned, I feel like this lecture, along with some of the other ones I'm going to do about composition, this lecture is really critical for your design analysis papers. So I just finished talking about the painting by Bellini and about how the use of the page structure, use of the geometry of like the corner to corner diagonals, how that was used narratively in the painting as well as part of a way to create a sense of structure and organization to the painting. Notice that not only does this diagonal go from the corner, right, through this arc and to, in a parallel line right through his heart, but it also, these two lines really connect him to the city or town that he has removed himself from. Now take a look at the geometry here of, um, of the Giotto painting. And I want to say, one of the things to pay attention to is that oftentimes when you start putting these lines down, one of the effects is going to be that they're going to actually make the painting perhaps look even more structured and kind of like and carefully composed than already before. Like you are literally adding new lines to the composition. So sometimes for some of these, I will actually show you the work with the lines and then without the lines so that you can kind of see the difference. But for most of these, I think, especially the ones where we've seen them other times without any kind of grid on top of them, we can kind of see it for its own. So notice the importance of the corner-to-corner diagonals and especially where it leads us to in terms of the center. But I think also probably the really most important diagonal is this from kind of the 2/3 on one side to the 1/3, a little bit lower than 1/3 on the other side. This diagonal that goes across there, that is this leading line that leads us to this moment, right? And then if we take that as a horizontal line as well, we can kind of see this sort of, this structure and how everything is leading us there. Okay, here's a classic example. Many times, for many teachers, many art books, they may not talk about this topic about page structure at all, with the exception that they might talk about it for this one painting, because this painting is such a great example of, of kind of page geometry at work. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this painting is that if you look just at the gestures of the figure and what is going on narratively, you would feel like this painting is a tumultuous, very active, chaotic painting, right? If you did it just by looking at it moment by moment. But if you bring your eyes back for a second and look at the whole, you will see that it's a very calm and composed picture. And I think that that kind of timelessness, that composition, and that kind of sense of stable and non-changing quality to the composition has a lot to do with the way so many of the elements of the composition are lined up with geometric measurements, right? Lining up with various different kind of marcations. And like probably the most notable one is this corner-to-corner diagonal and how these figures line up with that, right? But then there is the corner-to-corner diagonal here as well, but then we also have these figures that are lining up off of that. Like this is a diagonal going from the corner to the, not to the midline, but to the line based off of this geometric position, right? The actual midline is right there. And if we did that line as well, we probably would also, we'd get a diagonal going right there, which would also relate to this figure, right? So they create this kind of spiraling pushing out from this, all coming from that corner, but it also feels very, very composed, very stable, very orderly because it's following the structure of the geometry. And here we have kind of like the opposite. And this is a perfect example of how a painting, when you put the geometric structure over the top, it all of a sudden looks very, very stable. But my point here is not exactly that it's very stable, that it's actually a little bit playfully off from stable. If you look at how it's composed, you can see that it's very thoughtful about these geometric positions, right? But that the overall movement of the painting is actually a play off of these geometric positions, where he's kind of languorously moving around them. right? So if we take a look at how it looks without, right, we can see that it has this very kind of loose and open feel to it, right? That doesn't feel kind of tied down to geometry, doesn't feel, and that's precisely because, that it's not locking into any of those positions. But the minute you actually put those positions down as marks, as lines on the, all of a sudden it feels so much more geometric. And I think that really kind of demonstrates that Watteau was both carefully thinking about the geometry of the page as he was trying to organize his composition, but he was also very carefully trying to not lock everything in. He was trying not to be Poussin. He was trying to be something else, something more loose and open and more free. Um, so here's a different kind of use of geometry, right? Very similar, or not very similar, but somewhat similar to the Bellini, where we saw the use of the geometry had kind of a narrative impact. In that case, where the line of the geometry created this sense of um, the kind of the vision or the presence of God coming down to the saint, right, to Saint Francis. Here we have the geometry playing as part of a narrative, in that the geometric structure of the painting becomes kind of elastic, and like a bow, it's pushing him towards her, right? So I put in not only this corner to corner diagonal, but then I put in an arc based off of that corner to corner diagonal, which was really hard to figure out how to do that in PowerPoint. Um, and and to get it to fit relative is not perfect, but it's close. And then I also put in, this is the diagonal to the midline right there, and then the diagonal corner to corner, and then the diagonal to the midline of this side. And you can see how it really does propulsively move everything, and how everything kind of fits into that geometry, right? So geometry can not only be a thing that creates stability and carefulness and composed and like a sense of not moving. It can do the opposite. It can create propulsion and activity. So here we have another example, right? I put in not only the basic geometry lines, but also the lines that represent this primary movement in the painting, the movement of light towards these figures, right? And notice how this is really from a 2/3 mark. This is a diagonal going from a 2/3 mark to a half mark, right? To the half side right there. And notice how everything kind of fits very carefully and is organized around that geometric structure. And so once again, we have a painter using that geometry as well as using the illusionistic movement of light to help tell a story, right? The light, once again, represents the divine, right? As the light shines on St. Matthew is called. And so, but the geometry of the page ties in with that light. So we've been looking at some of the paintings we've been looking at have been Baroque paintings, and I wanted to talk specifically about Baroque composition and how it's different. Earlier we were talking about Renaissance composition and their use of triangles, and here with Baroque composition, oh shoot, we're probably close to 9 minutes. I haven't actually checked. I'm going to stop right here, and then I'll get back to you with part 3.